In March 1991, Catherine, a 22-year-old music student, called American psychiatrist, writer and professor of psychiatry John E Mack for help after experiencing something strange a few weeks earlier. One night in late February, she'd finished work around midnight and started for home. But instead of driving home to Somerville near Boston, she drove in the northerly direction and thought to herself, "I guess I'll go for a drive." When she arrived home, she could not account for 45 minutes. Next day, she woke around noon and saw on the news something about a UFO. The object was seen over Boston and was either a comet or a meteor. The policeman and his wife reported that the object had stopped overhead and had shone a light down upon them. Meteors or comets do not do that. A TV channel showed a chart of the object's path from southern Massachusetts to the northeastern part of the state. Catherine was surprised because, although she did not see the UFO, she'd been travelling in that direction. She'd been reading about UFOs and was hoping to see one, but then hoping she didn't. What troubled Catherine and the reason for contacting John Mack was an unexplained nosebleed, the first ever in her life that had occurred shortly after the above episode, and that she'd answered positively to most of the questions of possible UFO encounters in a book about abduction experiences. In her first session with John Mack, she talked about a dream at age 9 where she was paralysed when some kind of creature with long fingers came up behind her and grabbed her. She wanted to scream and call for her mother, but couldn't talk. In another dream, from Christmas 1990, she was visiting her mother in Alaska and was in a spaceship with curved walls, and there was something in the room that looked like a big fish tank. She was unsure whether it really was a dream. She also had a fear of needles. After the session, she didn't see him for 9 months, but wrote him a letter saying she had impressions from Christmas 1990 of a ship in the fields behind her mother's house in Alaska. She also became nervous after watching the movie Communion, based on Whitley Strieber's book, and described seeing an odd light in a cloud moving across the horizon 6 months before, and discovered a small scar under her chin for which there was no explanation. Over the following 8 months, he did 5 hypnosis sessions with Catherine. Catherine's first abduction experience occurred when she was 3 years old. She said she remembered waking up in the middle of the night and seeing a being at a bedroom window with a blue light coming into the room from behind it. The family's home was a one-story mobile home, and Catherine figured that this funny-looking being outside the window would have to be tall or was floating because the window was several feet above the ground, and the being's thin torso could be seen in the window. It had huge black eyes, a pointed chin, and a line for a mouth, and a nose that did not look like a human nose, but a bump. She could see nostrils, but not as large as ours. He wasn't wearing any clothes, and had a bluish look about him caused by the light coming from behind him. The being came through the window and materialized at the end of the blue light. When the beam hit the floor, the being appeared to levitate out of the doorway to the hall. It was like monsters were coming to get her, but they were real, and there was nothing she could do about it, and cried for her mother. She tried screaming, but couldn't move, and they did something to help reduce her fear. She then started floating. Some beings appeared in the living room. They were picking things up and looking at them. Catherine said that she floated through the front door. It's the middle of the night, but it's light. In the field outside her home was a ship with light coming from it. The ship was this shape. A few months after the interview, she wrote more about the episode in a letter. She remembered being floated out the front door and took her into a round room in the ship with a long bench. The bench had a red cushion along it. There are other young children there. A taller female being enters and says to her, "Do you want to play?" She had the feeling she was a teacher or care centre leader. Catherine was confused, but said, "Okay." She seemed pleased with her answer. She looked at the other children, and the room seemed very bright. The female had a metallic ball which floated. She flew it around the room doing loop-the-loops. Some of the children are trying to fly it, but not as gracefully. They hit the walls, which made a metallic clang. She said, "Would you like to try?" And she said yes, because I want to show up the other children. She gave her a metallic rod with a short antenna coming out of the top. It's silver grey and smooth. The antenna was about 4 inches long with a small ball at the end. The rod is like a remote control and you point it at the ball to guide it, but you have to concentrate at the same time. Catherine made it stop, hover, before coming to a dead stop after moving very fast. She did much better than the other children, who looked frustrated. The female then took the rod away. She told her she did very well, but made the other children feel bad as they didn't do as well. In their third session, Catherine's next encounter occurred at the age of 7, when she was at one of her friend's house and felt drawn to leave and go down an alley to see the neighbours' peacocks. There was a little man standing in the alley who had a big head, big eyes and no hair. He said he wanted to take her somewhere, but she said she's not supposed to go with strangers. He said it's okay, but she felt afraid and angry. She tried to run away, but he had his hand on her arm and she couldn't run. Catherine started crying in the session and said, "I don't know him and he's going to take me away. We're flying up and it's scary. I can see everything below me. It is not supposed to be like that." Catherine thought of hitting the little figure, but she couldn't move. He just thought it was funny. We're inside a room where the little man said, "I'm going to make a little cut." And she said, "You can't cut me." He said, "We have to." She said, "That's mean." He said, "It's for scientific research as we need blood." He made a little cut on the 4th finger of her left hand, which hurt less than she'd expected, with an instrument like an eyedropper made of metal. He took a small amount of blood. She asked why, and he replied, "Because I'm researching your planet." She asked, "Well, what's wrong with my planet?" He says, "We're trying to stop the damage." She said, "What damage?" He said, "The damage from pollution." She said, "I don't know about that." And he said, "You'll learn." He then took her back to the alley and after landing on the ground said to her, "We'll be back." Catherine calculated that 50 minutes had passed and discovered that no one had missed her when she rejoined the group of children watching television. However, when she was back in the house, she thought she'd just been outside. What had just happened was immediately erased. A small horseshoe-shaped scar remains on her ring finger for this day, for which Catherine had no other explanation than the incident above. The next story that relates to the UFO phenomena occurred when she was about 16. It involved unexplained lights on the hillside behind the mobile home where she was living with her mother, father and brother, but no abduction seemed to have occurred. When Catherine and her mother were driving back to their home, they saw little lights moving parallel to each other close to the ground. Her mother pulled the car over and they watched for a few minutes as the light did strange things that a plane could not do. Once in the house, her mother lost interest. However, Catherine continued to watch through the window. Complex movements of 3 or 4 lights on the hillside dancing around. At one point, they swooped down, but Catherine could not get her mother to take any interest. Catherine felt alone and isolated in relation to the UFO abduction phenomena, where Catherine wondered whether the lights were just her imagination. For her next session, they reviewed the steps leading to being forced to lie on a table. She noted the muted lighting in the room and again felt the loss of any will of her own. The examiner was taller than the others and his skin seemed a very smooth whitish grey and was not wearing any clothes. He looked at her like he looked at a frog before dissecting it. Everything around the room looked metallic, like brushed aluminium, but darker. Other beings performed various tasks. Their movements were cat-like and graceful. Then Catherine started panting and crying as one of the beings spread her legs apart on the table. He put his hand on her leg and thigh, which felt cold, and Catherine could not do anything about it. He then put a cone in her. That doesn't hurt. It just felt like it shouldn't be there. Catherine sensed it was taking samples. After it was retracted, Catherine believed that tissue samples were taken from the uterus lining, the cervix and the fallopian tubes. A metal instrument was then inserted into one nostril. The examiner had this thing with a handle on the end. It was long and flexible, and he put it in as far as he could before hitting something in the back and just pushed it through whatever it was. She felt something break on her head when he pushed it through and broke whatever it was as he pushed it all the way up. The procedure was uncomfortable, but didn't actually hurt. He broke something to get into her brain after hearing something snap in her head. Catherine was afraid of bone fragments in her brain. The examiner then scrutinized her, trying to figure out what else they needed to do. John Mack asked her about his eyes. "They're much bigger than our eyes, and they don't blink, and they're slanted on their head. They're all black, and she couldn't see any pupils, retina, or whites." He asked her what was so disturbing about the eyes, and she believes they don't care. A kind of curiosity. She's not a person, but an experiment. They'd care if she died, as it had ruined their experiment. The feeling was of total helplessness. They think they're superior to us. Then several beings let Catherine get off the table and took her into another room. As she was passing through the room to another place, along the left side of the room were cases stacked in rows reached from the floor to the ceiling. In the cases were baby-like versions of them and were all in a liquid and all facing out, and the cases were lit from the back. The creatures were naked and standing up, like a doll in a case, like a window display. They're all standing there and fully submerged in a liquid. The heads are large and in the same proportions of the bodies as the alien figures, but miniatures. She was then led along a walkway through a doorway to another room, wearing only her t-shirt. She entered an even larger room that curved to the right. The edge of the ship was maybe 50 feet away. Catherine found herself in a forest in a room with trees and rocks and dirt. There's forest all around, but she could still see the curving walls of the ship. The forest even smelled like pine trees. She was then taken back to the room she'd originally entered and given back her clothes. They walked her back across the field to the door. They opened the door and she went to sleep. Throughout it all, she believed it was not a dream and didn't think she was meant to remember, and it scared her to think it was real. In their third regression, she spoke about the incident in late February 1991, where she'd driven to a wooded area under some sort of compulsion in the town of Saugus, north of Boston. It was this event that led Catherine to contact John Mack. The Saugus encounter was the central abduction experience of Catherine's case. She had followed the signs of the Saugus ironworks and sat for 5 minutes in the parking lot before realizing that it didn't make any sense. She became increasingly lost and drove through a residential section before coming to a wooded area, believing it was a way back to the highway, but then realized it was not the way to the highway and went back. Extremely anxious, she drove through again, stating, "I think something happened, but I don't know what." Catherine could see streetlights from outside of the woods. It was lighter around her than it should be. But then she was able to move her hands and sense something coming behind the car. It then opened the door. It was a long, thin, light-coloured hand with 3 fingers, which then guided her out against her will. She's now behind the car and the being is behind her. It had huge black almond eyes and was glowing. Sensing her fear, the being calmed her down. It walked with her along the road and took her into the woods. She told John Mack she felt powerless and could do whatever they wanted her at any time and was helpless. She felt her trip was forced upon her and made her think she was doing it for other reasons. She said he's taking her up and they fly off. They came to a huge silver metallic ship with lights all over it. He takes her inside into a hallway. There's 4 beings pulling at her clothes. She's pissed off, she said. "I'm perfectly capable of doing this myself." And they get annoyed. Now naked, Catherine was led into an enormous room the size of an airplane hangar. There were hundreds of tables with hundreds of humans, all having things done to them. They walked her through this room where she saw rows of tables on either side, separated by perhaps 5 feet, with human beings on them having procedures done. She estimated between 100 and 200 humans in the room. Catherine was now on the table and saw a black man with a beard on her left. Then an examination began. They ran their fingers down her spine like they're counting the vertebrae. Repulsed by the touch, she exclaimed mentally, "What the hell's that for?" "To make sure everything's okay," it said. They're feeling her arms, legs, ankles, neck and thighs. She asked about the purpose of the examination. They said, "There may be things you don't know about." A taller being came over and stared at her and told her that she asked too many questions, that it's good to cooperate, and that what they were doing isn't bad, it's necessary. "I won't try to hurt anyone." As they stared into her eyes, she felt that she'd had no choice but to look back. He knows exactly what she's thinking because he's answering her questions before she even thinks of them.
Looking into its eyes was scary, and she felt it wanted to know her personally. Then told her they're going to take it out, and she thought, take what out? They bring a cart with a cylinder and it's filled with clear liquid. He then spreads her legs and she thinks, God, what are you going to do? What followed was the most disturbing experience of Catherine's abduction. The being then inserted a big metal thing. Then he took a longer and thinner version of it and put it inside her. She felt that he was trying to reach something inside her body in order to cut it off. She said, oh God, he's taking it. She could feel him cutting inside her. He takes out the thing you put in her and there's something attached to the end of it. It looked like a fetus about the size of a fist. He gave it to someone with a cart with a tank on it and wheels it away. The examiner said, you should be proud of yourself. She felt like a glorified incubator. She said, you won't tell me a goddamn thing. How many other humans have you done this to? He said, a very large number. Catherine said, you should have asked me. They took her off the table, and as Catherine looked at the other people on the tables and felt sad for them, they took her back to the room where she put her clothes back on. Catherine was floated back to the driver's side of the car where she drove out of the woods, noting that it was 2:45 a.m. and about 45 minutes had passed for which she could not account for. Once home, she went straight to bed and fell asleep. After the regression, Catherine believed that an impregnation with the fetus might have occurred during the Christmas abduction in Alaska. Catherine came to the conclusion that the aliens are more advanced spiritually and emotionally than we are, and they don't have the need to be as emotional as we do. By the time of the July 1992 meeting, Catherine had noted several changes in herself which were the direct result of a shifting attitude towards the abduction experiences and a greater psychological openness. She has greater intuitive abilities in relation to other people. She can feel people's auras, the energy fields around us that some, especially sensitive people, report seeing, and is more sharply attuned to the emotional states of others, which she finds useful. She said that one of the beings said, do you understand that everything's connected, canyons, deserts and forests, and one cannot exist without the other? Catherine, like other abductees, suggested the things she had experienced were not from our space-time. How all things are connected and you have a connection to them.